It was midnight over the fog-covered airfields of western Germany. The winter of 1944 had frozen the earth solid, and the moon, pale and distant, glimmered faintly off the sleek metallic skin of a new kind of bomber, one the Germans believed would change the course of the war. Its wings looked nothing like the heavy, clumsy silhouettes that once lumbered toward London. This machine was a whisper in the air, a shadow meant to slip unseen past Allied radars. Engineers called it a marvel of physics. Pilots called it the ghost. But just before its maiden flight across the Rhine, deep underground in a dimly lit bunker, a message arrived that chilled every man in that room. British and American radar stations, hundreds of miles away, had already picked up its signal, before the bomber had even left the ground. For the scientists who had sworn this aircraft was invisible, the news was impossible. They stared at one another, speechless, as if the very laws of science had just betrayed them. How could the enemy see what should not exist? How could the Allies detect a plane designed to be undetectable? This was not merely a setback. It was humiliation and the beginning of a race between two invisible enemies, one building the perfect stealth weapon and the other developing the unseen eye that could pierce it. The story of how America saw Germany's invisible bombers before they took off begins long before that night. In the early years of World War II, when both sides were still trying to understand a new kind of warfare that used not bullets or bombs, but invisible waves in the air. By 1939, radar, radio detection, and ranging was still a mystery to most of the world. To the average soldier, it was little more than a magic trick, sending radio waves into sky and listening for echoes that bounced back from aircraft. But in a handful of laboratories, from Berlin to London, from Massachusetts to Norway, scientists realized that whoever mastered this invisible technology could control the skies. In Britain, the chain-home radar network stretched like a wall of invisible towers across the coast, giving early warning of German bombers during the Battle of Britain. Those signals, faint blips of light on glowing green screens, gave the Royal Air Force just enough time to scramble fighters and intercept Luftwaffe raids. It was radar that turned the tide, not luck or weather, and Germany noticed. The Luftwaffe scientists at firms like Telefunken, Lorenz, and Siemens were no less brilliant. They were determined to find a way to make their bombers invisible to those green screens, to build aircraft that could pass through the radar's eye without leaving a trace. At first, they tried brute force, destroy the radar towers. But no matter how many they bombed, more appeared. Then they tried speed, bombers that could outrun detection. But the Allies' technology evolved faster. Finally, by 1943, Hitler's high command began funding projects that bordered on science fiction. Stealth. Deep in secret facilities in places like Göttingen and Oranienburg, physicists and aerodynamicists studied how to bend, absorb, or scatter radio waves. The mathematics were daunting. Metal reflected radar waves too well. Angled surfaces could scatter them, but only if designed with extreme precision. And then there was a strange idea emerging from an experimental aircraft designed by two brothers, Walter and Raymar Horten, who believed that a plane without a fuselage or tail might reflect far less radar. Their design, the Horten Ho 229, was unlike anything the world had seen. A flying wing, smooth curved, almost organic in shape, made largely of wood and composite materials impregnated with carbon dust to absorb radar signals. Its jet engines were buried deep inside, leaving almost no radar-reflective edges. To the human eye, it looked like something from the future. To radar, it was supposed to be invisible. When Luftwaffe engineers saw the first prototype glide silently over the test field, they believed they had found a miracle weapon that could strike England undetected. If this aircraft could reach London, it could also reach the eastern ports, the invasion fleets, even American bombers assembling over the Channel. Germany, they thought, would have its vengeance. But the Allies were not blind. Across the ocean, in a quiet research facility in Massachusetts, American engineers had been listening literally to the echoes bouncing off Europe. They had captured faint reflections from German experimental flights, strange radar signatures that didn't match any known aircraft. It puzzled them. Some signals appeared weaker than expected. Others vanished entirely before reappearing seconds later. Something was happening, something deliberate. Then came a moment that would change everything. Allied intelligence intercepted fragments of German communications describing Endsturzflugzeug, disturbed aircraft, a cryptic phrase hinting at radar interference. The British immediately alerted their American counterparts. The race for stealth had begun. To the Allies, radar had already proven itself a decisive weapon, but what if Germany found a way around it? The thought terrified commanders. So the U.S. Signal Corps and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Radiation Laboratory, the Rad Lab, began to reimagine radar entirely. Instead of relying on single, narrow frequencies, they began experimenting with broader bands, using higher frequencies that could detect smaller targets with more accuracy. It was dangerous, costly work, but by mid-1944, America's newest radar systems were astonishingly sensitive. Sensitive enough, perhaps, to pick up even the faintest signature of a flying wing made of wood and glue. So when Horten's prototype rolled out for its first high-speed run, those invisible waves were already waiting for it, bouncing across the skies of Europe like silent hunters. The German pilots had no idea. To them, the airfield was safe, far from Allied bombers. They taxied the ghostly aircraft forward, engines whining like banshees in the cold night. The control tower cleared them for takeoff. But hundreds of miles away, radar operators in England and northern France were already watching the faintest, most elusive echo they had ever seen, a shape barely perceptible, flickering in and out of existence on their cathode screens. They didn't know what it was. Not yet, but they knew something new was in the air. The irony was bitter. In trying to create the invisible bomber, the Germans had forced the Allies to sharpen their sight. Every advancement in stealth became a lesson for radar. Every experiment in invisibility made detection stronger. It was as if the two sides were building each other's nightmares. And yet, in that underground German lab, when a message came through that American radar had seen what should not be seen, disbelief turned to quiet panic. Someone had outsmarted them. Someone had looked straight through their shadow. What they didn't realize, not yet, was that radar itself had evolved beyond their imagination. The Allies weren't just detecting aircraft anymore. They were beginning to map their movements in real time, predicting flight paths, identifying signatures, even distinguishing between decoys and real targets. Germany's invisible bombers had been born into a world that could already see ghosts. The scientists swore it had to be a mistake. Interference, faulty readings, atmospheric distortion. But as more reports arrived, one thing became undeniable. The Allies could see their stealth aircraft before they ever left the runway. And that revelation, that chilling moment when invisibility itself was defeated, would ignite one of the most secret and desperate scientific battles of World War II. A battle not fought in the skies, but in the silence between signals. As dawn broke over fields of Oranienburg, the hangar doors of the Horten facility creaked open once more. The sleek flying wing sat bathed in pale sunlight, its dark surface shimmering faintly with the carbon-infused paint that was meant to swallow radar waves whole. Raymar Horten stood beneath the aircraft's vast arc, arms crossed, eyes cold with disbelief. He had spent years convincing the Luftwaffe that this shape, this idea, could make Germany untouchable. Yet, somewhere across the channel, American radar operators had already proven him wrong. But the German command wasn't ready to give up. If the Allies could see their invisible bomber, then they needed to understand how. Inside that same hangar, a small group of physicists gathered around chalkboards and oscilloscopes, sketching strange waveforms and electromagnetic reflections. Maybe, one of them whispered, they've built something new, something beyond our understanding. He wasn't wrong. Across the Atlantic, in the sprawling laboratories of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, America's Rad Lab had become the beating heart of radar innovation. Within its corridors, engineers and physicists, many refugees from Europe, worked day and night on systems so advanced they bordered on the futuristic. Their secret? A leap from conventional radar frequencies into what they called microwave radar. Unlike the long, sluggish waves used by early British systems, microwave radar emitted ultra-short pulses, sharp, precise, and almost impossible to fool. They could bounce off smaller targets, penetrate through thin layers of material, and measure motion with astonishing accuracy. Even a plane made of wood and carbon, designed to absorb reflections, could not escape the faint whisper of its returning echo. But detection alone wasn't the full story. The real breakthrough came from something called Doppler shift analysis. Engineers discovered that even if a plane's body absorbed most radar energy, the motion of its engines, especially the spinning turbine blades, created tiny variations in the returning signal. It was as if the sky itself was speaking, revealing movement where no reflection should exist. To the untrained eye, the radar screen showed nothing but static and faint glimmers. But to the new generation of American operators, those irregular blips meant everything. They were signatures, ghostly fingerprints of aircraft once thought invisible. In mid-1944, when Allied intelligence intercepted reports of a tailless jet bomber, the news electrified the Rad Lab. American analysts realized that Germany might have built something far beyond conventional aircraft design, perhaps the world's first stealth jet. So they began developing radar systems with adaptive frequencies, what they called frequency agility. If a German plane could absorb or deflect a certain frequency, the radar would instantly switch to another. It was like shining light from different angles until the shadow revealed itself. For the first time in history, radar wasn't just watching, it was hunting. Back in Germany, those strange detections caused chaos. The Luftwaffe demanded explanations. How could the Americans detect what physics itself said should be invisible? Horten and his engineers tested every theory. Was it the jet exhaust? The angle of the wingtips? The heat from the engines? They even coated prototypes with layers of special glue mixed with powdered charcoal, believing it might absorb more energy. Still, the radar reports didn't lie. The Allies could see them. And worse, the Germans began to notice something eerie. Even when their bombers were still on the ground, Allied fighters sometimes appeared overhead, almost as if the enemy knew exactly where they were hiding. It wasn't coincidence. The Allies had refined airborne radar to such precision that reconnaissance planes flying high above the clouds could detect not only bombers in flight, but the outlines of hangars, runways, even camouflaged aircraft waiting for orders. This was not just science anymore. It was sorcery in the eyes of the German command. They began to believe the Allies had found a way to see through clouds and earth. Some even whispered that America had discovered a new kind of ray weapon. In truth, it was a combined effect of improved radar, new mapping techniques, and a secret American device called H2X. H2X, known among crews as Mickey, was an airborne radar mapping system developed from British technology but pushed to extraordinary levels by the Americans. Mounted on B-17s and B-24s, it could paint a radar image of the ground below in near real time. Entire cities, rivers, and forests appeared as glowing shapes on phosphorescent screens. It was so powerful that by late 1944, Allied bombers could navigate and strike targets even in total darkness or thick fog. But it did more than that. It revealed reflections no one expected. Faint, unusual blips moving near test fields deep inside Germany. Those echoes didn't match any known aircraft pattern. When analysts compared them to intercepted German documents describing a jet-powered flying wing, the puzzle pieces began to align. Somewhere in Germany, a ghost plane was taking shape. By autumn, the Allies knew its approximate location. High-altitude reconnaissance confirmed strange hangar activity near the town of Gotha. From that point forward, the site was under constant surveillance, invisible to the Germans, but glowing on the Allies' radar scopes like a secret heartbeat in the dark. Raymar Horten's frustration grew. Every test flight seemed to end the same way. Their invisible machine was somehow exposed before it even left the airfield. The engineers began to suspect that radar was no longer just bouncing off the aircraft. Perhaps it was detecting heat, exhaust, or ionized gases from the jet engines themselves. And that was partially true. By late 1944, American scientists were experimenting with infrared detection, an early form of what would one day become thermal imaging. Though primitive, these systems could detect the heat bloom from jet exhaust at surprising distances. The combination of radar and infrared meant that even if a plane evaded one form of detection, it would likely fall prey to the other. Germany had built the world's first stealth aircraft, but the Allies had built the world's first system designed to defeat stealth. And so, the Luftwaffe doubled down. They poured resources into radar countermeasures, chaff, jamming transmitters, and radio deception. Some bombers dropped bundles of aluminum strips known as duppel, which created false radar echoes to confuse Allied operators. But it was never enough. American radar crews learned to read through the noise. They could tell real targets from decoys by analyzing how echoes moved, their velocity, rhythm, and consistency. The Horten brothers begged for more time, more funding, more materials. They believed that if they could build a fully jet-powered version of their flying wing, it might finally escape the radar's reach. But time was something Nazi Germany no longer had. Fuel was scarce. Factories were being bombed daily, and the Allies' invisible eye in the sky only grew stronger. One night, as American bombers roared over the Rhineland, a young Luftwaffe officer stared at the radar screen inside a German command post. The green glow illuminated his face as he watched dots multiply across the scope. Hundreds, maybe thousands. His superior leaned over and whispered, "They know. They see everything." In a way, he was right. The battle for invisibility had turned into a war of total exposure. The more the Germans tried to disappear, the more visible they became. By the end of 1944, the invisible bomber program had become a ghost story within the Luftwaffe, a dream that radar had killed before it was ever born. Yet, as the Allies closed in, the scientists behind it refused to surrender their ideas. They began hiding research papers, blueprints, and prototype materials, burying them in basements, caves, even forest bunkers, because they knew invisibility was not a failure. It was simply ahead of its time. And soon, as the war ended and the victors divided the spoils, the true legacy of Germany's invisible bombers would cross the Atlantic, straight into the hands of the men who had seen them first. The war was ending. Cities burned in silence. Factories lay in ruins. And somewhere in the chaos of collapsing Germany, the secrets of its invisible bombers were being packed into crates, hidden in tunnels or abandoned in snow-covered hangars. When the Allied armies advanced in early 1945, they found something that made even their most hardened intelligence officers pause. Inside one half-destroyed hangar near Friedrichsroda, under a tattered camouflage net, sat the strange, swept shape of the Horten Ho 229, Germany's ghost plane. Its dark wooden skin still shimmered faintly, its engines removed, its wings cracked from an air raid. Yet to the American officers who first laid eyes on it, the design looked like something that shouldn't exist in the 1940s. It didn't look German. It didn't even look earthly. The wings flowed into each other seamlessly. No tail, no fuselage, no sharp metal edges. It was the embodiment of stealth, decades ahead of its time. And though the war had crushed the dreams of the men who built it, the discovery of this aircraft would ignite a new kind of arms race. One not of tanks or bombs, but of invisibility and detection. American engineers quickly moved in. Under Operation Paperclip, the Allies began rounding up German scientists, engineers, and research documents before the Soviets could reach them. Among those quietly transported to the United States were aerodynamicists and physicists who had worked on stealth-related designs, radar absorption coatings, and high-speed aerodynamics. The Horten brothers themselves were interrogated about their work, how they conceived of radar absorption, how they designed a wing that could scatter reflections. Their explanations stunned the Americans. Much of what the Hortens described matched principles that wouldn't be formally rediscovered until decades later. Angles of reflection, resonance frequency, and materials designed to trap electromagnetic waves. The Allies realized that they hadn't just defeated Germany militarily. They had inherited the blueprint for the future of warfare. The remains of the Horten Ho 229 were shipped to the United States under heavy guard. Inside hangars at Freeman Field, and later at Wright Field in Ohio, teams of American engineers examined every inch of it. They tapped its wooden panels, measured its curvature, and studied the carbon-infused glue that was meant to absorb radar energy. The conclusion? The Germans had been astonishingly close. Tests showed that the Ho 229's radar signature was dramatically smaller than any conventional aircraft of its time. Against early radar, it might have appeared only as a faint echo, a flicker on the edge of scope. If it had reached production, if it had flown in numbers, it could have changed the war's outcome. But history decided otherwise. Still, that knowledge was too valuable to forget. The American engineers at the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the organization that would later become NASA, began experimenting with flying wings of their own. The Northrop YB-35 and later the YB-49 were born directly from those captured German designs. Even Jack Northrop, the visionary behind them, was astonished when he saw photos of the Horten prototype. They were thinking the same way we were, he said quietly, maybe even a little ahead. But it wasn't only the aircraft that impressed the Americans. It was what the Germans had feared most, the radar that could see them. The men of the MIT Radiation Laboratory, the very ones whose microwave radar had pierced the myth of invisibility, were now pushing radar to limits no one thought possible. Using lessons learned from the war, they developed post-Doppler systems capable of detecting aircraft by their motion alone. They experimented with multi-frequency scanning, phase array antennas, and radar imaging. In essence, the technology that had once exposed Germany's stealth jets was now being refined into something that could map the Earth itself from space. The Invisible War had not ended. It had simply gone underground. In the years after 1945, both the United States and the Soviet Union scoured through Germany's captured research. The Soviets recovered their own shared documents and scientists from the East, igniting a shadow race to master radar and stealth. Each side wanted to see without being seen. Each side wanted to own the invisible. By the 1950s, American scientists began revisiting an idea buried in the Horten archives. What if the shape of a plane, its very geometry, could make it disappear from radar? The mathematics was complex. It involved how electromagnetic waves scattered off surfaces. But the concept was clear. If radar was an eye, then stealth was camouflage for the sky. The Cold War turned those ideas into reality. The F-117 Nighthawk, decades later, would fly with a shape that looked alien. Flat surfaces, sharp angles, every panel calculated to deflect radar energy away. But in many ways, its ghostly DNA traced straight back to 1944, to a pair of German brothers drawing sketches of a flying wing on a war-torn night. And radar, the invisible hunter, evolved alongside it. As aircraft became harder to detect, radar systems became smarter. They used synthetic aperture imaging, post-compression, and electronic countermeasures. Every time one side tried to vanish, the other side built a clearer eye. The duel that had begun in the skies over Germany never truly stopped. Yet, there is something poetic about it, that in trying to hide from destruction, mankind invented new ways to see. When American technicians finished examining the Horten Ho 229, they shipped it to storage. Today, what remains of it rests in the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, its wings still stained with the memory of a dream that came too late. Standing before it, one can almost imagine the cold airfields of 1944, the engineers watching their invisible creation tremble as its engines came to life, unaware that the enemy could already see them through the clouds. It is a haunting irony of war. The moment you believe you cannot be seen is the moment you are most visible. For the German scientists, the discovery that their invisible bomber had been exposed before it even took off was more than scientific failure. It was the end of faith in their own superiority. But for the Americans, it was proof that knowledge, not fear, would define the future. Radar had done more than win battles. It had changed how humanity perceived the world. It could pierce storms, navigate oceans, detect the curvature of mountains. It became the foundation of weather forecasting, air traffic control, and space exploration. The same invisible waves that once tracked bombers now guide airplanes safely across continents. And yet, the ghosts of that invisible war still linger. Every stealth fighter that takes off today, every radar dish turning silently in the night, carries within a fragment of that forgotten duel between a German dream of invisibility and an American obsession with sight. In the end, the invisible bomber never flew into combat. It never reached London, never turned the tide. But it did something far greater. It changed the way the world saw the unseen. When the German scientists stood before the wreckage of their creation, watching Allied soldiers photograph it piece by piece, one of them reportedly murmured, "They can see everything." He was right, because from that moment on, the sky was no longer a place of mystery. It was a map, one that radar could read like an open book. And the age of invisibility, born in the ashes of war, was only just beginning.